a long time, science told a straightforward story about Iceland. The settlers arrived from Norway in 874 AD. They were Norse. Their descendants were Norse. And when geneticists finally sequenced Iceland's ancient founding population in the 21st century, they expected to confirm what the sagas had always said: a Nordic island nation genetically coherent, descended from a small group of Scandinavian seafarers who had crossed the North Atlantic and built something from nothing. The data did not say that. What it said instead was stranger, more painful, and once you understand what happened over the 11 centuries that followed, something closer to a miracle than a footnote. The accepted model of Iceland's founding is one of the better documented origin stories in European history. The sagas record it in detail. Norse chieftains fleeing the consolidation of Harald Fairhair's Norway sailed west across the Atlantic, landed on an uninhabited volcanic island, and built the world's oldest parliamentary democracy. The settlers were warriors, farmers, and poets, and the record names them: Ingolfur Arnarson, Other, the deep-minded, Egil Skallagrimson. The founding population was small, perhaps 8 to 20,000 people in the first 2 generations. But the sagas give them faces, genealogies, and stories. 3 reasons the Norse model seemed airtight. First, the language. Modern Icelandic is the closest living language to Old Norse. A modern Icelander can read the 12th century sagas without translation in a way no modern Scandinavian can. That linguistic purity implies cultural isolation. And cultural isolation, the reasoning went, implied genetic isolation too. Second, the surnames. Icelandic naming conventions are explicitly Norse patronymic, unchanged since the settlement age. Bjornsson, Sigurðardóttir. There is no Gaelic naming layer visible in the modern population. Third, the location. Iceland was genuinely uninhabited before Norse arrival. No indigenous population existed to complicate the founding story. The settlers arrived into a blank. Their descendants, the logic went, were purely theirs. In 2000, a team led by Agnar Helgason at Decode Genetics in Reykjavik published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics. They were not looking for a controversy. They were mapping mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line, mother to child, unchanged generation after generation except for the slow tick of mutation. The Norse model predicted that Icelandic DNA would cluster tightly with Scandinavian lineages, Norwegian and Swedish haplotypes inherited from Norse women who crossed the Atlantic in the 9th century. Instead, roughly 62% of Icelandic mtDNA lineages trace directly to the British Isles, specifically to Ireland and Scotland, not the paternal line. The Y chromosome, which tracks Norse ancestry, was predominantly Scandinavian, as expected. But the maternal line, the line that runs through every mother and every grandmother back to the founding generation, was overwhelmingly Gaelic. Something was wrong with the story that had been told for 1,000 years. The question is not why the scientists were wrong. The question is why no one thought to look. 3 structural reasons the error persisted for 11 centuries. First, the saga's record power. The Icelandic saga, the Icelandic family sagas, some of the most detailed historical narratives produced by any medieval culture, were written by men, about men, for the purpose of establishing land rights and genealogical legitimacy. Women appear in the sagas when they advance the plot or establish a lineage. The Gaelic women who came to Iceland did not write the sagas. They did not hold land. Their names, when recorded at all, were recorded as thralls, enslaved people, the legal property of Norse men. A thrall's maternal lineage was not a genealogical asset. It was not recorded. And what was not recorded did not exist as far as the textual evidence was concerned. Second, the available tools. For most of the 20th century, population genetics worked from blood types and protein markers, blunt instruments that could identify broad clusters but could not resolve fine-grained maternal or paternal inheritance. The specific technique required to separate mtDNA lineages by geographic origin. Haplogroup analysis at high resolution became practical only in the 1990s. The absence of this finding before 2000 was not negligence. The tool did not exist. Third, the identity investment. Iceland's linguistic and cultural identity is explicitly Norse. That identity is not incidental. It is the foundation of a small nation's claim to a unique place in European history. The oldest parliament, the oldest literature, the direct inheritors of the Viking Age. Questioning the genetic composition of the founding population was not a neutral scientific act. It was potentially a political one. The question was not often asked because the answer, whatever it turned out to be, was going to be complicated. Mitochondrial DNA behaves differently from the DNA in a cell's nucleus. Nuclear DNA is shuffled and recombined with every generation. You inherit roughly half from each parent, but which half is different every time. After 10 generations, a specific ancestor's nuclear contribution may have diluted to near zero. After 30, it is statistically undetectable. Mitochondrial DNA does not recombine. It is copied in full from mother to child. Your mTNA is, with only minor mutations, identical to your mother's, and to her mother's, and to her mother's before that, a direct, unbroken chain reaching back tens of thousands of years. Every woman alive today carries a maternal lineage that can be traced, haplogroup by haplogroup, to a specific ancestral population in a specific region of the world. Ánjar Helgason and his team at Decode Genetics collected mDNA samples from Icelandic individuals whose 4 grandparents were all born in Iceland, ensuring they were sampling genuine founding lineages, not recent immigrants. They then compared those haplogroups against reference populations across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and continental Europe. The Gaelic signal was not subtle. It was not a trace. It was the majority of the maternal founding population. A follow-up study by the same team, published in 2001, refined the numbers. Approximately 37% of Icelandic mdDNA traced to Scandinavian origins. Approximately 62% traced to populations from Ireland and Scotland. On the paternal side, the Y chromosome, the ratio inverted, roughly 75 to 80% Norse, 20 to 25% Gaelic. The interpretation was unambiguous. The men who crossed the Atlantic were predominantly Norse. The women who crossed with them, the women who built Iceland's founding maternal gene pool, were predominantly Gaelic. Let that settle for a moment. The nation that speaks the closest living language to Old Norse. The nation whose founding myths are explicitly, proudly, entirely Norse. The nation whose surnames, laws, literature, and self-understanding trace directly to Scandinavia. That nation's founding maternal lineage, the genetic thread that runs to every Icelandic mother to the settlement age, was majority Gaelic. The women who built Iceland were not primarily Norwegian. They were Irish. They were Scottish. And the mechanism by which that Gaelic ancestry became invisible, the process that erased it so thoroughly that an entire nation spent 11 centuries believing something else, is the real subject of this video. Shaw's, the Helgason et al. 2000 study demonstrates that haplogroup H, V, and J lineages, all characteristic of Norse populations, account for only 37% of Icelandic maternal diversity. The remaining 63% falls into haplogroups characteristic of Irish and Scottish Gaelic populations, primarily haplogroup H subclades specific to Atlantic-facing Western populations, and haplogroup T2 variants well documented in the Irish archaeological record. The gender asymmetry in those numbers is the key. Y chromosome data from the same population shows the inverse ratio, approximately 75% Norse paternal ancestry, 20 to 25% Gaelic. This asymmetry has one plausible explanation at civilizational scale. The Norsemen who settled Iceland brought Gaelic women with them, not as equal colonists but as enslaved people. The sagas use the Old Norse word erkiel, thrall, the same root that gives English the word enthralled. A thrall was property. A thrall's ancestry was irrelevant, and yet a thrall's mitochondrial DNA was transmitted in full to every child she bore. Rules out. The alternative explanations do not survive examination. Could the Gaelic signal reflect later migration, Post-settlement movement between Iceland and the British Isles. The sampling methodology accounts for this. Helgeson's team specifically excluded individuals whose four-grandparents were not all Icelandic-born. The lineages being sampled were genuinely founding lineages, not later arrivals. Could the result reflect genetic drift? Random fluctuation in small populations amplifying a minor Gaelic signal over time. The opposite argument applies here. In a small founding population, drift tends to reduce minority lineages, not amplify them. A 62% Gaelic signal in the maternal line is too large to be a drift artifact of a minor original presence. It reflects a genuine majority in the founding maternal population. Could there be a sampling error? The 2001 replication study, using an independent dataset, returned nearly identical ratios. Two independent studies, same result, implies. The largest defensible conclusion is this: Iceland was not founded by Norse men and Norse women. It was founded by Norse men and Gaelic women. The Gaelic women were, in all probability, enslaved, transported to Iceland, not as voluntary settlers, but as human property of the Norse chieftains the sagas celebrate. They had no names in the written record. They had no land rights. They had no genealogies the sagas thought worth preserving. But they had children, and those children had children. And 11 centuries later, the majority of every Icelander's maternal genetic ancestry runs directly through those unnamed women, through the women the founding documents erased. If you're finding this worth your time, there's more of this kind of work on this channel. The science of ancient DNA keeps recovering people that official history decided weren't important enough to remember. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Here is where it gets more complicated, and I want to be honest about where this gets complicated. If 62% of Iceland's founding maternal lineage was Gaelic in the settlement age, why do modern genetic surveys of Iceland show a lower Gaelic maternal signal? Why, in some recent studies, does the Gaelic proportion appear to have declined? The answer is genetic drift, and it is one of the more disorienting findings in population genetics. Iceland's founding population was small. Estimates range from 8,000 to 20,000 individuals across the first two generations of settlement. Small populations are subject to something called the founder effect, compounded by random genetic drift across generations. The random process by which some individuals leave more descendants than others causes certain lineages to expand and others to contract, not because of any selective advantage but through pure chance. A 2009 study by Einar Antonin and William Burke at the University of Iceland, published in PLOS One, modeled the expected drift trajectory of Icelandic mitochondrial lineages across 50 generations. Their finding was striking. The Gaelic maternal signal should, under neutral drift conditions, have remained relatively stable or declined only modestly. The drift they detected in the actual data was greater than neutral models predicted. This matters for a specific reason. It suggests that the founding Gaelic women, the enslaved population, may have experienced differential reproductive success compared to Norse women in the founding generation. Enslaved women had less control over their reproductive lives. Their children had different social status. In a small founding population, differences in reproductive success translate directly into differences in which lineages survive the next 10 generations. The implication, and I want to be precise here, because the data suggests, rather than confirms this, is that the erasure of Gaelic women from the saga record may have had a biological dimension, as well as a documentary one. The genetic signal was not only suppressed in writing, it may have been partially suppressed in biology. Two serious objections deserve direct acknowledgement. The first comes from geneticists who argue that the Norse-Gaelic ratio in founding Iceland has been overstated because the reference populations used, modern Irish and modern Scottish, are themselves products of thousands of years of subsequent migration. The Gaelic populations of the 9th century may not have had exactly the haplogroup distribution of modern Irish and Scottish populations. Agner Helgeson's own published responses to this objection note that the core age subclade distribution characteristic of Atlantic-facing Western populations is robustly documented in pre-Viking Age ancient DNA from Ireland and Scotland, making the identification reliable despite this limitation. The objection is real. The answer is solid, but the limitation deserves acknowledgement. The second objection is interpretive rather than genetic. Some historians argue that the term Rau in the sagas encompasses a wider range of social statuses than the English word enslaved fully captures, that some Gaelic individuals in Iceland arrived as voluntary settlers, as the Gaelic-Norse cultural mixing documented in the Northern and Western Isles suggests was common. This is a legitimate historical point. The genetic data does not itself establish the conditions under which Gaelic women arrived in Iceland. It establishes that they arrived in large numbers and that their maternal lineage built the genetic foundation of a nation, whether they came as enslaved people, as wives, as concubines, or as free settlers in a mixed Norse-Gaelic expedition. The sagas did not think their ancestry worth recording. That documentary silence is its own kind of evidence. The Gaelic community in Ireland and Scotland today is not a relic. It is not a thing of the past. Irish and Scottish Gaelic cultures remain living, actively maintained, and in the case of Irish, constitutionally recognized as a first national language. The descendants of the same Atlantic-facing Western populations whose women built Iceland's maternal gene pool are still here, still speaking related languages, still maintaining traditions that predate the Viking Age. And there is something worth sitting with in that fact. The women who came to Iceland, whatever the exact conditions of their arrival, were people with full lives before Iceland. They had families in Ireland or on the Scottish coast. They had languages. They had knowledge of plants, of tides, of how to keep children alive through a North Atlantic winter, knowledge that Norse settlers in an uninhabited volcanic island would not have survived without. The sagas had no interest in recording this. The sagas were concerned with land rights and battle deeds and the honor of named Norse chieftains. But the DNA does not share the saga's concerns. The DNA recorded everything. Here's what I keep returning to. The saga writers made a reasonable bet. They recorded the powerful and ignored the enslaved. 11 centuries is a long time. Oral traditions fade. Documents burn. Languages drift. Landscapes change. The safe bet, that historically well-supported bet, was that the Gaelic women who came to Iceland in the 9th century would vanish from the record entirely. Their names, their origins, their faces, their presence in the founding of a nation, all of it absorbed into silence. That bet was almost right. Almost. Because mitochondrial DNA does not care about sagas. It does not care about land rights or patronymic surnames or the political utility of a pure Norse founding myth. It copies itself from mother to child in full, generation after generation, carrying a haplogroup signature that originated on the Atlantic coast of Ireland and Scotland tens of thousands of years before a single Norse ship was ever built. Every Icelander who has ever lived carries that maternal line. Every child born in Reykjavik today carries it. The nation that built its identity on the Norse sagas is, in its maternal foundation, majority Gaelic, and will remain so regardless of what any document has ever said or failed to say. The women the sagas forgot are still there. They never left. 11 centuries of silence. And the biology held. The question that remains, and that current ancient DNA sampling of settlement-age Icelandic archaeological sites may eventually answer, is whether any of those founding Gaelic women arrived voluntarily, not because the answer changes what the DNA shows, but because it would change what we are allowed to call what happened to them.